Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Davina Wood from the Affordable Housing Institute, and today I'd like to talk a bit about why it's important that rental as a tenure isn't overlooked when it comes to incorporating sustainable resilient features. And I'm going to showcase some examples of recent projects that we've worked on at AHI to see what we've learned and to try to pinpoint some potential opportunities or ways in which we can promote the incorporation of resiliency and sustainability features in rental specifically. I'll first just quickly introduce the Affordable Housing Institute. We are a nonprofit impact consultancy that focuses on housing in emerging markets. We work around the world, not just in Africa, although we do quite a bit of work in this continent. And generally speaking, we work with a diverse set of actors, but our services can sort of be grouped into 4 different things. The first is developing strategy and policy for governments. The second would be research-related work for DFIs or other institutions like CAF. Feasibility studies and the structuring of housing PPPs, as well as market research for investors looking to enter the space. Recently, we've been doing a lot of work on rental. And just to sort of set the scene a bit, I think it's always important to remember how crucial it is that resiliency be top of the agenda in Africa especially. We know that the impacts of disasters and climate change are more than twice as significant for poor households than others, because they tend to live in more vulnerable areas and they often have weak housing standards and limited or no access at all to credit or insurance. Some recent studies have also shown that, or more specifically, the World Risk Index study showed that of the 15 countries identified as the most vulnerable to disasters, 13 of these are located on the African continent. And that floods and droughts are the largest cause of death and economic woe as well. And I think that, one of the key outcomes from COP27 shows that this is something really we need to focus on, that being the climate justice outcome, that where nations for the first time agreed to set up a fund to provide payout for developing countries that are suffering loss or damage from climate-driven events. So why the focus on rental? Well, what we know is that rental is often the dominant tenure in Africa. We talk so much about housing that's for sale, and we often overlook the fact that actually most people can't buy a house. In some cities, more than 75% of the population rents. And rental stock is often less climate resilient or sustainable because neither the landlords nor the tenants are incentivized to invest in green building or retrofitting. Tenants have very little leverage when it comes to that as well. On a different note, building a dynamic rental sector is also key for modern workforces, which are more mobile, and there's more flexibility in the rental market. And if we're talking about moving people out of hazard zones, then rental can present a sort of temporary fix there. Also, something that we always talk about when it comes to rental is long-term operations and maintenance, and what a challenge that is, and that's where you can really see sustainability issues coming to the fore. Also, there's a lot of opportunity and potential for scale, right? So if you talk about rental in terms of a multifamily context, if one owner-operator really prioritizes building resilient or green housing, then loads of households can benefit. It's not just one at a time. And the image on the left there is an example of where, when multifamily rental goes wrong, what can happen and what high risks are really at stake. That's a building collapsing in Nairobi. Just briefly, assuming that rental is multifamily, there's even more we can talk about when it comes to sustainability gains. Informal rental tends to have really low verticality. Replacing that with multifamily housing increases density, decreases the footprint. And I wanted to highlight a study that was recently done by Diversity and Arup. Diversity is based in South Africa, that looked at where and how housing is built in cities and the effect on households' carbon footprint. It's kind of hard to see that graph on the right, but the study looked at middle and lower income families, so those were the two groups, and it looked at families that live in the urban center versus the urban periphery. And what it found is that low-income families in the urban core have the lowest carbon footprint, and middle-income families, which is the bar on the far right, that live in the urban periphery have the highest. And it was less related, it was partially related to the housing's construction and build materials, but it was also really related to transport costs. And middle-income families tend to rely on private vehicles, whereas lower-income families, especially those living in the urban center, are in multifamily and are relying more on public transportation. So I think what this is, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that if we think about rental in multifamily, and especially talk about it in the context of urban densification, it can definitely have a very positive impact on the environment. All of this, though, frequently requires, in order to get it done, a mission-motivated developer, like some of the ones we saw during our Shark Tank session earlier. It's really hard to accomplish this in a purely for-profit setting, I would say. Now I'll talk briefly about some of the projects we've worked on at AHI. I think probably the bottom line, and this image is supposed to show that, is that sustainable rental is really hard. It's really hard to get it right. It's hard to achieve. This is a photo from Cameroon of some public rental housing. It just illustrates the long-term challenges structurally when it comes to maintenance. We're actually still working on a project in Panama that's about coming up with solutions for rental housing solutions for migrants and refugees. And I know that Panama is far away from Africa, but there are some things we can learn and we can talk about. Panama is a very unique context, and it's the rental market is unique in that there is a huge amount of vacant stock, mainly because of investors wanting to invest in Panama because of the tax opportunities, and also a large demand. So what we were trying to see with this project is how can we leverage existing assets, thinking, trying to prevent the overexpansion of the urban footprint, use what's already there, use the embedded energy that's already there in that existing cement. It's a challenge because a lot of these units that are there and are vacant for a reason. They were never built to be rented. But government is trying to come up with ways to incentivize these owners to open up the units. And other things we're looking at are renovating or retrofitting existing buildings to increase density and add rental to the market. I also think the Panama example is sort of interesting because it really shows the communities that you're working with, how vulnerable they are. So these are families that are often political refugees who have left, for example, Venezuela. They arrive, they have no papers, they have no job. Informal rental where they're really vulnerable. The most vulnerable communities is all they can really access. A couple of years ago, we did a study for CAF in Cameroon about the rental housing market there. And this project involved a household survey of around 700 households. what came out in the numbers was that Cameroon, much like a lot of African countries, has a very large rental market. Almost 55% of households in urban centers rent. A lot of them are renting secondary dwellings, backyard units. That's what you see in the image on existing property. But one thing that emerged was that landlords are not only using tontines or saving groups to finance the construction of these backyard dwellings, they're also, a lot of them are doing maintenance through those financial institutions. And so that is a potential way in which to promote retrofitting, ways in which, when that household comes to get the loan to do some renovations in between tenants, to encourage them to make their houses safer, to do retrofitting with green financing. So this is an example of very grassroots green financing opportunities. In Peru, we're currently working with the Inter-American Development Bank to develop a rental program. Their government has several successful programs in place, as some of you probably know, to encourage home ownership, but rental is not something they've really broached. They do have a green mortgage program, but not a lot of people don't really know about it, and they're not really accessing it. A feature of the Peru project is that we're also, one of our recommendations is surrounding PPPs, but we're trying to look at how the Peruvian version of a REIT, which is called a FIBRI or FIBRA, how to attract those institutional investors. So an idea is to try to sort of unlock the sustainable investment class by adding green features to these PPP projects so that you can kind of, as I said before, leverage institutional investors' appetites for sustainable investments. That photograph is a perfect example of a second room or a rental unit being built directly on top of an existing structure. And finally, I just want to talk very briefly about a World Bank project in Ethiopia about rental housing for industrial park employees. So what was happening at these parks was that the local housing opportunities for the people who worked there were really, really poor. There wasn't enough housing, and it was all very low quality, so the turnover at the parks is huge. And the potential opportunity here is that you have real private sector reasons why to get involved and why to develop rental or to work with other actors to develop rental, because if they don't have employees. So this hasn't necessarily happened, but it's a good example of where you could potentially government work on PPPs or create incentives for those companies to add features to the dormitory-style buildings that they're looking to build that are greener or more resilient. So just to wrap up, I think highlighting the need for resiliency and how other actors need to get involved in rental is important, because tenants really, they don't have any recourse. There's no way they can necessarily push for that. And it encourages us to really support these impact-driven entities. Some of the companies that were pitching earlier, Tough is a great example, because they're working in the rental space and they see the long-term benefits of adding green features into this tenure that otherwise gets very much overlooked. So I hope that little snapshot of this was interesting to everyone. Thank you for your time today.